whispers of a discovery. It began in the most unassuming way, as many of history's most pivotal moments often do. The observatory was small, perched on a quiet ridge where the night skies still shimmered without interference from urban haze. Its staff, underfunded and overworked, were accustomed to routine, plotting faint objects, logging orbital drift, cross-referencing data no one else bothered to study. Yet one winter night, a junior astronomer named Dr. Keller noticed something peculiar, a faint, elongated smear cutting across a patch of the sky that should have been unremarkable. At first, he thought it a lens artifact, or perhaps a glitch in the processing software. But the trace persisted, night after night, its slow crawl marking a path too deliberate to be dismissed. Keller, cautious not to embarrass himself, kept silent at first. He compared old sky charts, pulling images archived over decades, and soon realized the smear had appeared faintly before, hidden among cosmic clutter, moving with a patience that only something vast and distant could command. He began whispering to his closest colleague, a woman named Dr. Alvarez, whose instincts for anomalies had made her both respected and feared among her peers. Together, they recalibrated the instruments, waiting through nights of exhaustion, only to confirm the unsettling truth. This was no ordinary comet. Its brightness was inconsistent, pulsing in a way that suggested more than reflected sunlight. Its orbit, when calculated, defied easy explanation. The whispers spread across their observatory, carried on hushed voices over coffee-stained desks. Some dismissed it, a curiosity at best, a distraction from real work. Others, however, felt the chill of unease settle into their bone. There was something about the trajectory, something about the numbers, that hinted at an approach far closer to Earth than comfort allowed. When Keller finally drafted his first internal memo, he wrote cautiously, framing the object as 3I divided by Atlas, a third known interstellar visitor, after the infamous Oumuamua and Borisov. But unlike those, this one was larger, darker, and oddly silent in ways instruments could not explain. Already, the name began to echo in private discussions. 3I divided by Atlas, as if invoking something ancient and mythic, a titan looming unseen. The report should have ended there, locked away in obscure journals or buried in data repositories. Yet, as so often happens, the most fragile secrets slip first through careless hands. A low-ranking technician, tasked with backing up nightly logs, copied Keller's files onto a personal drive, intrigued by the mention of anomalous trajectory. Within weeks, the memo had found its way to a quiet corner of the internet, where amateur astronomers and conspiracy theorists alike gathered. The whispers no longer belonged to the observatory, they had escaped into the world. For most, it was background noise, one more speculative claim in the endless tide of cosmic rumor. But for those who lingered over the details, who ran the orbital calculations on their own, the unease grew sharper. 3I divided by Atlas was not on a harmless pass. If the equations were correct, if the speed and angle were what Keller and Alvarez feared, then its approach intersected with Earth's orbital neighborhood in unsettling ways. No alarm sounded, no headlines broke. The official institutions remained silent, perhaps unaware, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge what a handful of underfunded scientists had stumbled upon. And so the whispers continued in quiet places among observatories, late-night forums, and private chat rooms, where those who paid attention began to sense that something vast and unknowable had already set its course toward them. The hidden report. The observatory's memo should have remained a footnote, an obscure technical document buried beneath the noise of academia. Yet what spread quietly through amateur circles soon reached eyes it was never meant for. Somewhere in the shifting labyrinth of government monitoring, a flagged keyword, anomalous trajectory, tripped an automated system. Within days, Keller's internal memo was requested through official channels, stripped of his name, and filed under a classification tier he would never be allowed to see. Inside a dimly lit office in Geneva, a handful of officials convened around the digital copy. The report was dry, a string of calculations, graphs, and muted speculations, but something in its margins caught their attention. Keller's tentative phrase, planet-crossing potential. The wording was cautious, but the implication was not. A body of that size, entering from interstellar space with such velocity, could not simply be catalogued and forgotten. The response was swift. A directive circulated to scientific agencies, disguised as routine coordination, urging silence until further data validation. Keller and Alvarez received no acknowledgement of their work, no request for clarification. Their data streams began to show strange interference, as if access itself were being quietly pruned. They whispered their concerns, increasingly uneasy at how quickly the objects seemed to vanish from the open record. And yet, the disappearance only fueled suspicion. Amateur astronomers, who had saved cached copies of Keller's figures, began comparing notes in private forums. When one of them leaked an annotated version of the memo online, highlighting the ominous orbital intersection, interest surged. For a brief moment, 3I divided by Atlas trended in obscure scientific corners, its trajectory debated by enthusiasts who barely understood the math but sensed the dread behind it. That brief moment was enough. A second leak appeared, not from Keller, not from Alvarez, but from within the government's own chain of custody. It was a fragment of an internal briefing, stripped of identifiers, but heavy with implication. Impact risk assessment ongoing. Preliminary models indicate potential energy release, equivalent to multi-continental event. Further confirmation required. The language was clinical, designed to obscure rather than illuminate, but its meaning bled through. Someone, somewhere inside the system, had recognized the danger. Someone had put into words the scale of what might unfold, and now those words escaped their cage. The public, still largely unaware, dismissed the fragment as a hoax, but in quieter circles among journalists with long memories of cover-ups, among researchers who knew the bureaucratic cadence of classified briefings, the document rang with authenticity. It carried the fingerprints of an official process, the hollow voice of risk management where urgency should have screamed. Keller never admitted to seeing the leak, though Alvarez confronted him one night in the observatory. "They know more than they're saying," she whispered, her eyes glinting under the pale red glow of instrument lights. "And if they're hiding it, it means they don't know how to stop it. D2 need. And if you why, in another rate." From that night on, their work took on a hushed intensity. Each new frame captured, each recalculated orbit, added weight to their unspoken fear. What had begun as a faint blur across the stars was now becoming a secret too large to contain, a truth pressing against the fragile walls of silence that governments and institutions scrambled to maintain. The whispers, once confined to observatory halls, were no longer whispers at all. They had become a pulse, steady and insistent, echoing through the hidden channels of the world, warning that 3I divided by Atlas was more than a passing curiosity. It was a threat, and it was coming closer. Anomalous origins. As the hidden reports circulated in encrypted channels, the debate shifted from the object's trajectory to something even more unsettling: its origin. Every celestial wanderer carries a story etched into its motion: the tug of a parent star, the violence of an ejection, the scars of collisions long past. Yet 3I divided by Atlas defied those familiar narratives. Its velocity was too precise, too sharp, as though it had been launched rather than lost. Alvarez was the first to voice it aloud, though she regretted it instantly. In a late-night session, hunched over residual data from their dwindling access to telescopes, she muttered, "It doesn't behave like a comet. It behaves like something made." Keller froze, staring at her with the unease of someone hearing blasphemy in a cathedral. "Don't say that again," he whispered, though he couldn't shake the thought. The official documents, those that slipped beyond firewalls into investigative hands, hinted at similar suspicions. Annotations mentioned non-standard reflectivity, unexplained energy variance, and one phrase that sent shivers through the few who saw it: possible engineered morphology. Such words were never supposed to leave secure servers, never meant to find their way into the fragile network of leakers and skeptics threading them together. Yet they did, and the story that emerged was darker than any prediction of impact. If 3I divided by Atlas was a natural body, it was one unlike any in the catalogues. Its surface, according to spectral analysis, lacked the chemical fingerprints of frozen gases expected in interstellar comets. Instead, it reflected a strange composite signature, as though metal and stone had fused under pressures not found in any planetary nursery. Some speculated it was the shard of a dead world, flung into the abyss after its own catastrophic ruin. Others whispered of forgotten civilizations, crushed by their suns, leaving behind fragments adrift like tombstones in the void. The more radical voices pushed further. They claimed the object's velocity aligned too neatly with the galactic plane, its path slicing toward Earth not as accident but as intention. Ancient debris does not choose. It does not aim. But what if this one had been aimed long before human civilization had risen, set on a path that only now intersected with a vulnerable world? Keller dismissed these ideas publicly, though in private his notes betrayed unease. His equations revealed micro-adjustments in the object's brightness, as though it rotated in a controlled rhythm rather than tumbling chaotically. Alvarez, less afraid of taboo, recorded in her journal a single line: "It is not just arriving, it is returning." That idea spread like wildfire among those who lived at the fringes of official science, where speculation filled the void left by silence. They dug into mythology, into the stories of celestial beings who came from the dark to undo the world. They found strange alignments, floods in Mesopotamian epics, skyborne flames in Norse sagas, tales of falling stars that destroyed empires. To them, 3I divided by Atlas was not a stranger. It was the latest mask worn by something humanity had always known, always feared, but had buried beneath myth. Meanwhile, governments doubled down on their silence, treating the object's origin as a dangerous distraction. To admit ignorance was one thing, to admit possibility was another. Still, the leaks continued, and each fragment of data pulled the narrative further from the safe shores of natural science towards something far more unsettling. In the quiet of the observatory, Keller found himself staring not at the numbers but at the stars themselves, wondering if somewhere in that black ocean lay the hand that had set this thing in motion. For the first time, he understood that the question of what 3I divided by Atlas was might prove as terrifying as the question of what it would do. Silent warnings. By the time the whispers of anomalous origins began to filter into the fringes of public awareness, Keller and Alvarez had already tried to raise their concerns. They drafted letters, careful and restrained, addressed to international space agencies, to government science councils, even to a few sympathetic journalists. The words were chosen with precision, avoiding the sensational, clinging to the sterile armor of data, trajectory, inconsistency, orbital intersection, anomalous properties. They hoped the numbers would speak for themselves, but the silence that followed was louder than any reply. Days passed, then weeks, with no acknowledgement. Alvarez suspected the letters had been intercepted, filtered out by unseen hands before reaching their intended readers. Keller clung to the hope that perhaps their warnings had reached someone, somewhere, but if so, why was no action taken? In truth, action had been taken, but not the kind they imagined. The briefings about 3I divided by Atlas were now held behind doors guarded by men who carried no insignia, in rooms without windows. Specialists were summoned, bound by non-disclosure agreements and veiled threats, instructed to maintain public confidence. The official narrative remained intact: no imminent threat, no reason for alarm. What was unfolding was not an investigation but a containment. Meanwhile, a handful of scientists elsewhere, working with partial data, began to see the same troubling patterns. Seismologists in Japan, tracking deep vibrations in the Earth's mantle, noted irregular pulses they could not explain. Radio astronomers in South Africa picked up faint, recurring distortions, as though space itself were being perturbed. When they tried to correlate their findings with orbital data of 3I divided by Atlas, requests for confirmation were met with unusual delays or sudden denials. The few who dared to speak publicly found their words drowned in discredit. A professor in Toronto published a short article suggesting the interstellar body's energy signature was non-natural. Within hours, her university received pressure to retract it, citing methodological errors. A team in Chile held a small press conference about orbital risk probabilities, only to have their funding mysteriously suspended the following week. Alvarez saw these patterns for what they were: a system-wide silencing, designed not to clarify, but to obscure. One night, exhausted, she told Keller, "They're not ignoring us. They're afraid of us, afraid of what we might say." He wanted to argue, to cling to the idea that truth would prevail. But in his heart he knew she was right. And so the warnings continued, not through official channels but through whispers, encrypted messages, and coded forums. Astronomers, journalists, even rogue data analysts shared fragments of information, weaving a tapestry of dread out of incomplete threads. They spoke of impact probabilities, of tidal models that suggested waves taller than mountains, of shockwaves that could ripple through the Earth's crust. Always, though, these warnings remained in the shadows, drowned by the louder voices of authority that promised calm skies. The danger was no longer just the object hurtling through space, it was the silence itself. For in that silence, humanity was left unprepared, lulled into complacency, while 3 divided by Atlas drew ever nearer, indifferent to the walls of secrecy erected against it. Keller began to keep his own warnings hidden in plain sight, embedding coded anomalies into published star catalogues, leaving subtle clues for anyone who cared to notice. It was a desperate act, born not from faith that it would make a difference, but from the gnawing need to resist the silence pressing down on him. As the weeks dragged on, the object grew brighter, a speck now visible in stronger amateur telescopes. Those who looked saw more than just light. They felt unease, a sense of being watched by something vast and ancient. And though the world around them still spoke of normalcy, the silent warnings grew louder in the minds of those who knew the truth. The disaster was approaching, and no one would say it aloud. Uneasy patterns. The silence might have muted official voices, but the sky itself could not be silenced. As winter gave way to spring, the faint blur of 3 divided by Atlas sharpened into a recognizable presence for anyone patient enough to track it. Amateur astronomers, unbound by government restrictions, began to piece together its behavior. They compared their images across continents, cross-checking each other's numbers. Slowly, a troubling pattern emerged. It was the trajectory. At first glance, it seemed to follow the erratic path of any interstellar wanderer, but the deeper they calculated, the more disturbing the alignment became. Each projection, refined with new data, revealed the same truth. The object's path sliced directly across Earth's orbital lane. It was not a distant grazer, not a harmless tourist of the solar system. Its arrival was set to intersect, almost perfectly, with the planet's position in time and space. Keller stared at the equations night after night, his pencil scratching feverishly across notebooks that grew heavier with each correction. The numbers seemed to mock him, as though written in a script designed to deny comfort. "It's too precise," he muttered once, and Alvarez, hunched over her own models, simply nodded. Neither spoke the word that lingered between them, inevitable. Outside their observatory walls, subtle tremors of unease began to ripple through the scientific underground. A researcher in Prague noted that the object's rotation did not follow chaotic tumbling, but a measured, rhythmic cycle. A pair of graduate students in Buenos Aires suggested the brightness curve was artificially consistent, as though maintained by some hidden symmetry. One brave analyst in Sydney went further, presenting at a small, poorly attended symposium. "The orbital path suggests intent, not accident." His words were dismissed in the official record, but within hours recordings of his talk spread online, stirring curiosity and fear. Yet patterns emerged not only in the object's motion but in the world's reaction to it. Observatories that reported too much saw sudden equipment failures. Forums sharing orbital simulations found themselves plagued with mysterious outages. Even the amateur astronomers who dared post their findings noticed their accounts flagged, their work drowned in waves of fabricated skepticism. It was as if the very flow of information was being sculpted, redirected to ensure no unified picture could reach the public. Still, patterns are stubborn things. They reveal themselves even when buried. Coastal tide monitors began detecting anomalies, subtle surges and retreats not tied to lunar cycles. Weather satellites recorded upper atmosphere disturbances, faint but recurring, synchronized with 3 divided by Atlas's slow crawl closer. Seismographs in disparate corners of the globe ticked in strange unison, registering pulses no one could trace. The Earth itself seemed to be resonating, humming faintly in recognition of the intruder. Alvarez saw it first in the data overlay, a series of spikes on different instruments that aligned precisely with the object's rotational rhythm. "It's connected," she whispered, her voice carrying both awe and dread. Keller frowned, unwilling to believe the Earth could already be feeling the presence of something still so far. But the evidence mounted, and soon it became undeniable. 3 divided by Atlas was not merely approaching, it was already exerting an influence, weaving itself into the fragile systems of the planet. To the few who noticed, these uneasy patterns were omens, faint sketches of a disaster not yet spoken aloud. The majority, shielded by the silence of officials and the noise of everyday life, carried on unaware. But in the hidden corners where numbers told the truth, a grim realization settled. If the patterns continued, if the alignment held, the world was not facing a distant hypothetical. It was facing a countdown, echoes of the past. The patterns were enough to unsettle the most skeptical of scientists, But what made them truly terrifying was how familiar they seemed. Humanity had always carried shadows of past catastrophes in its collective memory, though they were wrapped in myth, ritual, and forgotten languages. As 3I divided by Atlas drew closer, historians and mythologists began whispering among themselves, noting parallels between the object's projected timing and ancient accounts of calamities. Dr. Alvarez, restless after nights of calculations, turned her attention to dusty archives in search of solace. Instead, she found unease. Mesopotamian tablets spoke of a star that falls and drowns kings. Norse sagas recounted the sky-born stone that cracked the seas. Mesoamerican codices illustrated waves that consumed entire cities, drawn beneath symbols of fiery celestial visitors. The more she read, the less coincidence seemed possible. When she presented her findings to Keller, he was reluctant to listen. He clung to numbers, to orbital mechanics, to what he could prove. But even he could not deny that Earth bore scars, craters hidden under jungles, basins filled with oceans that aligned too neatly with past extinction events. Chicxulub had ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Tunguska had shattered forests without warning. What if 3I divided by Atlas was another chapter in the same recurring cycle? A rhythm written not in stars but in destruction. Some within the scientific underground dared to suggest humanity had not merely endured random cosmic accidents, but that something, perhaps even this very object, had returned again and again. The rhythm of mass extinctions, they argued, was too precise, too patterned across the eons to be chance. Perhaps Earth's history had always been bound to an unseen visitor looping back through time, erasing civilizations before they could rise too high. The thought infected Alvarez's mind. In her private notes, she wrote, "What if we are not the first to fear 3I divided by Atlas? What if others before us knew and tried to warn through myth?" It was not science, not the language she had been trained to trust, but the feeling gnawed at her nonetheless. Every story, every myth of floods and fires, suddenly seemed like fragments of an ancient warning encoded in human memory. The leaks began to reflect this eerie connection. Alongside orbital charts and energy models, anonymous sources began sharing cultural records, highlighting ancient disasters aligned with celestial appearances. One leaked briefing contained an unsettling phrase: "Potential cyclic intruder. Probability of previous encounters cannot be excluded." The words were clinical, but the implications were staggering. Publicly, of course, nothing was admitted. Government channels spoke of stable skies and safe orbits, but in quiet places, the idea of a returning destroyer spread. People who had never looked through a telescope found themselves staring at the night sky with new dread, wondering if their ancestors had once gazed at the same intruder. Keller resisted these thoughts as long as he could, but one evening, as he traced orbital models backward through time, he noticed a chilling alignment. Had 3I divided by Atlas passed close tens of thousands of years ago, it might have coincided with the mysterious collapse of early human settlements, the so-called Younger Dryas event that had plunged the world back into ice. He closed his notebook with trembling hands, unable to deny what he had seen. The past was no longer a comfort, it was a mirror, reflecting what might come again. Humanity had survived echoes of the intruder before, but not without scars. This time, with billions of lives at stake and a fragile global civilization, the echoes of the past felt less like myth and more like prophecy. The classified meeting. The whispers could be contained in academic halls and buried in forums, but governments could not ignore the numbers forever. In a cold, windowless chamber beneath Geneva, a select gathering of officials convened. They came draped in the symbols of their nations but left their flags at the door, for the matter before them belonged to no one country. The agenda carried only one item: 3I divided by Atlas, risk assessment. The room was sterile, its walls bare but for a central screen projecting orbital models that shifted like ghostly diagrams of doom. At the table sat generals, ministers, intelligence chiefs, and a handful of scientists whose expressions betrayed exhaustion more than fear. The chairperson, a grey-suited man whose name never appeared in the record, began with words rehearsed to sound calm. "Colleagues, you've seen the reports. Let us clarify where speculation ends and probability begins. Is Becting lined?" An astronomer from JPL rose and clicked through slides. The numbers were stripped of poetry, but they carried a weight that pressed on every chest in the room. The object's mass, larger than any interstellar body previously recorded. Its velocity, faster than the safe margins of planetary deflection. Its trajectory, intersecting Earth's orbital path within a window too narrow to dismiss as coincidence. The screen filled with simulations, one line after another slicing toward Earth. Thousands of probabilistic outcomes, almost all of them catastrophic. A defense minister slammed a hand against the table. "We've dealt with near misses before. Why not this one? Can't we nudge it off course?" The scientist shook his head. "Deflection requires decades of preparation. We have less than 3 years. Even nuclear yields would be negligible against this velocity." Another voice, quieter, asked the question none wanted spoken. "Impact probability?" The room fell into a silence, heavy as stone. Finally, the astronomer replied, "Between 6 and 14%, depending on new measurements. But even a near pass within 2 lunar distances will create gravitational disruptions strong enough to trigger tidal surges and tectonic stress." The words 6% echoed in the chamber like a curse. To the public, such odds might sound small, but to those who understood planetary defense, they were intolerable. No roulette table had ever been so merciless. As the meeting wore on, the arguments hardened. Some demanded immediate disclosure to the public, warning that secrecy would breed panic once the object grew visible. Others, wary of social collapse, urged containment of information until certainty could be reached. Intelligence chiefs argued in clipped tones about managing leaks, while generals debated whether missile systems could be adapted, knowing in their hearts it was fantasy. Then came the final, chilling presentation. A geophysicist displayed global maps showing tidal models. A glowing simulation rippled across continents, waves taller than skyscrapers battering coasts, pressure fractures opening beneath cities. "Even without direct impact," she said, her voice flat, "Earth's systems will feel it. Oceans, crust, atmosphere. The planet is not isolated, it will resonate." The meeting adjourned with no resolution, only directives. Suppress public discussion, expand surveillance of observatories, and continue mitigation studies that everyone knew would lead nowhere. The leaders walked out as they had entered, draped in silence, carrying the unbearable weight of what they now knew. But silence cannot contain dread. Fragments of the classified meeting leaked in vague summaries, stripped of attribution but heavy with implication. Phrases like multi-continental event and gravitational resonance risk began to appear in obscure corners of the internet. For those who followed the whispers, it was proof enough. The world's most powerful figures had gathered not to reassure but to plan for the unthinkable. Keller and Alvarez never knew the details, but they felt the change in the air. Observatories tightened their access. Grant requests were denied without explanation. Old colleagues stopped answering calls. Somewhere behind the curtain, decisions were being made not to save the world, but to manage how it would learn of its possible end. Public denial. The classified meeting in Geneva had ended with no plan for salvation, only strategies of containment. And so, while leaders whispered behind locked doors, the world outside was fed a steady diet of denial. The first official statement came from the European Space Agency. Preliminary data confirms no immediate risk to Earth. 3. I divided by Atlas is a natural interstellar body passing at a safe distance. The tone was measured, the words polished, but to those who had seen leaked fragments, it rang with a hollow clang. News outlets picked it up quickly, repeating the lines without question. Anchors smiled into cameras, assuring audiences that rumors online were unfounded. Articles mocked conspiracy theorists, portraying them as paranoid stargazers weaving doom from numbers they didn't understand. The public, fatigued by endless crises, gladly accepted the reassurance. Supermarkets bustled, markets ticked upward. Life carried on as though the sky above were unchanged. But beneath the glossy layer of denial, cracks widened. Amateur astronomers who had shared trajectory data online found their posts flagged or removed, often under the pretext of misinformation. Forums where the object had been discussed mysteriously went offline for hours at a time. Journalists who pressed agencies for comment received polite but chilling responses, often followed by unexpected visits from men in suits who asked far too many questions. Alvarez watched the narrative unfold with a kind of bitter awe. "They've turned it into a ghost," she said one evening, staring at the glowing monitor. "It's right there in the sky, and still they make people believe it isn't." Keller, weary, shrugged. Most people don't want the truth. They want to sleep at night, and denial is a comfortable bed. Yet even denial requires maintenance. Each passing week, 3i divided by Atlas brightened. Small observatories across Asia and South America confirmed its visibility through mid-range telescopes. Online, grainy photographs began to circulate, tagged with fearful captions. "It's real, look for yourself." Officials countered with dismissive statements, lens flares, misinterpretations, amateur error. But for those who had seen it with their own eyes, the denials only deepened suspicion. Then came the second wave of leaks. These were not memos or orbital charts, but heavily redacted briefing notes stripped of seals and signatures. The words within, though incomplete, were damning. They spoke of impact probability, of secondary gravitational hazards, of civil contingency modeling. Someone inside the system was defying orders, feeding fragments of the truth into the shadows. Forums buzzed with furious debates. Some clung to the official reassurances, desperate to believe. Others accused governments of staging a cover-up larger than any in history. Panic flickered at the edges but never caught flame. The denials still held sway over the majority. What did it matter if a few eccentrics shouted of disaster? The official word was clear: there was nothing to fear. Yet the denial came at a cost. In their effort to bury the truth, officials ensured humanity remained unprepared. No coastal evacuations were planned, no seismic precautions advised, no infrastructure hardened. The world slumbered in ignorance, blind to the countdown already etched into the stars. One night, Alvarez turned off her instruments and stepped outside. She looked up at the cold shimmer of the sky, where the faint glimmer of 3i divided by Atlas could just be discerned if one knew where to look. "They're not denying it to protect us," she whispered to Keller. "They're denying it to protect themselves, to buy time, to keep control." Keller said nothing, but in his silence she heard the truth. Control mattered more to them than survival. The world above was changing, drawing closer each night, and yet the world below clung stubbornly to its denial. The people, lulled by soft words and steady voices, did not see the storm gathering in the void. They lived as though the sky was eternal, but eternity was running out. Shifting skies. Despite the official reassurances, the sky itself became harder to ignore. As the weeks passed, even casual stargazers began to notice peculiarities. The constellation patterns they had known since childhood seemed subtly disturbed. A faint, moving speck cut across familiar formations, like an intruder trespassing on sacred ground. At first, it was only visible through mid-range telescopes, but soon amateur binoculars could pick it up. To those who watched carefully, it shimmered oddly, its brightness waxing and waning in ways no natural object should. The reports trickled in. Strange luminous trails, faint streaks of light that seemed to follow in the object's wake. Some observers swore they saw a haze around it, a halo not unlike auroras, as if it carried its own atmosphere. A group of university students in Chile captured long-exposure photographs revealing delicate, thread-like structures stretching away from the object lines of light, too symmetrical to be dismissed as cosmic dust. Government astronomers ignored the images, issuing curt dismissals about camera defects and misinterpretations. Yet the photographs multiplied, shared across forums and encrypted channels, each more convincing than the last. The skies themselves were shifting, and denial could no longer entirely contain what eyes across the world were witnessing. Alvarez studied the images with an intensity bordering on obsession. She printed them, pinned them across the observatory wall, tracing the faint luminous trails with her finger. "These are not dust tails," she told Keller in a hushed voice. "Comets scatter randomly. This is patterned. It repeats." Keller leaned closer, his skepticism eroding under the weight of evidence. "It's as if—" he hesitated, unwilling to complete the thought. "As if it's leaving a signature." What unnerved them most was how the trails aligned with Earth's orbit. Each shimmer seemed to echo the planet's path, as though the object were aware of where it was heading. The possibility was unspoken but heavy. 3i divided by Atlas was not just drifting, it was marking. Meanwhile, in parts of the world where skies were still unpolluted by city glow, ordinary people began to notice the difference. Farmers in rural India spoke of new stars that moved when no stars should. Fishermen in the Pacific swore the horizon glowed faintly where the object passed. Children, unburdened by denial, pointed up and asked their parents why the new star flickered so strangely. Panic, though, did not erupt. The official channels still held sway, and for most, life pressed on with its endless demands. Bills to pay, families to feed, wars and politics to argue about who had time to worry about a distant speck of light. Yet beneath the surface, unease deepened. The sky had always been humanity's one constant, the backdrop of eternity. To see it shifting, to know it harbored an intruder drawing ever closer, gnawed at something primal. In underground forums, speculation took on a feverish edge. Some argued the luminous trails were evidence of propulsion, proof of artificial origin. Others claimed they were fragments of debris, harbingers of smaller bodies that could strike ahead of the main object. A few, blending science with myth, insisted the glowing signatures were warnings, like cosmic runes carved into the night. For Keller and Alvarez, the patterns meant only one thing. The approach of 3I divided by Atlas could no longer be hidden. Soon, the world would see it with its own eyes, denials collapsing under the weight of reality. And when that happened, when the shifting skies betrayed the truth to billions, panic would not just be possible, it would be inevitable. The observatory nights grew heavier, each data point another drumbeat in the slow march toward revelation. They both knew it. The sky itself was beginning to scream, and humanity had not yet learned how to listen. Rising panic. The skies had shifted long enough to stir curiosity. Curiosity, in turn, had ripened into unease. But unease could still be ignored until the leaks resumed, this time sharper and harder to dismiss than before. It began with a cluster of documents released anonymously through encrypted channels. These were not just observational memos or blurred photographs. They were simulations, full, detailed models generated by agencies whose resources far outstripped any amateur effort. The files bore traces of official formatting, watermarked charts stripped of classification tags, but still carrying the cold precision of government science. And in their heart was the truth. Even a near miss by 3I divided by Atlas could tear Earth's systems apart. The simulations showed oceans rising in waves higher than skyscrapers, slamming into continents with the force of entire wars compressed into seconds. They showed coastlines vanishing beneath black water, cities drowned in hours, tectonic plates cracking under redistributed pressure. Some files spoke bluntly of planet-killing waves, a phrase that slipped through redaction like a wound refusing to close. The leaks spread quickly, far faster than sensors could contain. Within days, forums buzzed with fearful analyses, journalists whispered of forbidden files, and even mainstream outlets hesitated. They did not publish the documents outright, but their coverage shifted, their anchors speaking in a tone of careful caution. The language of certainty, safe trajectory, no risk, softened into ambiguity, unlikely threat, under further review. The public felt the change. Denial had been a balm, but now cracks formed in its surface. Questions multiplied. Why had the story shifted? Why were independent astronomers reporting disruptions the agencies refused to acknowledge? Why did leaked simulations look more convincing than official reassurances? Fear began to seep through daily life. In coastal towns, quiet rumors triggered quiet preparations, families stocking food, gas stations seeing unusual surges in demand. Survivalist communities flourished online, their videos teaching viewers how to seal basements, purify water, store grains. Governments dismissed it all as panic-mongering, but sales of emergency supplies told another story. In the observatory, Keller and Alvarez felt the change in the air. Emails arrived from strangers, engineers, students, even clergy begging for answers. Some were frantic, others resigned, many pleading for confirmation that the leaks were false. But the truth weighed too heavily on them to offer comfort. Alvarez finally stopped responding altogether, her hands trembling as she deleted message after message. "What can I tell them?" she asked Keller one night. "That they have 2 years to watch the sky until it falls?" Meanwhile, governments doubled their efforts to maintain control. Press conferences multiplied, officials smiling into cameras, insisting preparations were purely routine. Yet their eyes betrayed unease, their voices faltered in subtle ways. Each denial, once soothing, now sounded brittle, as though spoken against a storm already howling at the door. And then came the most haunting silence of all. Coastal sensors began to fail. Tidal monitors in the Pacific reported erratic spikes before going offline. Weather satellites transmitted garbled data. Some speculated it was sabotage, part of the information war raging between governments and truth seekers. Others whispered it was the Earth itself, already reacting to the pull of the intruder, systems cracking beneath forces no human hand could stop. In the public sphere, panic flickered like lightning. Supermarkets in certain cities emptied overnight after rumors of government preparation drills. Markets wobbled, though they were propped up with frantic reassurances. Yet the unease was spreading faster than anyone could contain. Denial had bought time, but time was running out. Keller, staring at his latest simulations, finally admitted aloud what had haunted him for months. "It won't even need to hit us," he murmured. "Just passing by, it will tear the world apart." Alvarez looked at him, her face pale in the glow of the monitor, and said nothing. There were no words left to soften the truth. The panic was no longer whispered. It had begun to rise, like the first swell of the very waves people feared, the vanishing probe. When panic began to stir in earnest, the governments of the world recognized that silence could not hold forever. They needed proof, or at least the illusion of control. And so, quietly, without announcement, a probe was prepared, an unmanned craft, repurposed from a mothballed asteroid mapping mission. Its new purpose was simple: intercept 3I divided by Atlas, gather data, and send back answers that could either confirm the worst or buy the world a little more denial. The mission was shrouded in secrecy, cloaked as a routine space test. Even the scientists brought in to work on it were told only fragments, compartmentalized so no single person knew the full design. But word has a way of slipping through cracks. Astronomers noted unusual activity at launch sites, unexplained adjustments in orbital traffic. Soon, whispers emerged. A probe had been dispatched to meet the interstellar visitor. For weeks, nothing reached the public. The launch was silent, its trajectory hidden in bureaucratic jargon. But in underground circles, excitement grew. Some saw it as a chance to finally uncover the truth. Others feared it would provoke the object in ways they could not understand. Keller and Alvarez watched with grim interest, knowing the mission would either confirm their worst fears or vanish into silence like all warnings before it. At first, telemetry arrived smoothly. The probe sailed through space, instruments alive, transmitting streams of data. Minor updates leaked through unofficial channels. The object was larger than expected, its surface darker, its albedo closer to engineered alloy than ice or stone. One phrase appeared in a redacted memo: irregular geometric facets detected. He seems, then, without warning, the transmissions faltered. Signals grew faint, corrupted by static. Data packets arrived, scrambled, repeating the same fragments. Temperature spikes, magnetic surges, inexplicable pulses of radiation. And then, nothing. The probe was gone. Official channels dismissed it as a technical failure, the kind that had plagued space missions since the dawn of the space age. Signal loss, they said, is not uncommon in deep space operations, but the timing was too sharp, too sudden. Just as the probe neared its target, its voice was silenced. The fragments that survived the blackout told a stranger story. A handful of intercepted files showed anomalies, a rhythmic distortion in the probe's magnetometer, pulses too regular to be natural. Engineers who saw them argued it looked like interference, as though the object had responded to the probe's presence. One analyst, speaking off record, muttered, "It was almost like it noticed." Conspiracies multiplied. Some insisted the probe had been destroyed, struck by debris or swallowed by forces no one understood. Others claimed its silence was artificial, that it had seen too much, and its data had been buried. A particularly haunting rumor suggested the probe had not been destroyed at all, but redirected, its trajectory altered by an unseen hand. Keller and Alvarez studied the leaked telemetry with growing dread. "This isn't noise," Alvarez whispered, pointing to the repeating signal buried in static. "It's a pattern." Keller wanted to deny it, to dismiss it as corrupted code, but the evidence was undeniable. The signal rose and fell with uncanny precision, like a heartbeat echoing across the void. For the first time, Keller considered something he had resisted for months. 3I divided by Atlas was not just an object. It was an entity, or the remnant of one. The silence of the probe was not a failure of machines, but the first direct contact with something humanity had no language to describe. When the official denial came, telemetry lost due to equipment malfunction, it fooled almost no one. The truth was clear to those who had followed the whispers. Humanity had reached out across the darkness, and the darkness had reached back. The probe was gone, but in its vanishing it had left a message more chilling than any data. 3i divided by Atlas was not a passive visitor. It was aware. Cracks in the earth. The vanishing of the probe should have been enough to shatter denial. But the world above still clung to illusions. It was the earth itself that forced the truth, whispering in deep tremors that no press release could silence. It began subtly, with scattered reports of strange vibrations from seismographs in Chile, Iceland, and New Zealand. At first, scientists attributed them to routine tectonic activity, the kind of background murmur the planet had always carried. Yet as days passed, the tremors spread, aligning across fault lines that had no reason to stir together. Seismic pulses rippled simultaneously across continents, rising like the faint rhythm of a drum too vast to be local. Keller received the first charts through a colleague in Japan, who sent them quietly, unsigned. The graphs showed spikes that mirrored one another almost exactly, despite originating from stations thousands of kilometers apart. "This shouldn't be possible," the colleague wrote in the margin. "It's like the Earth is vibrating in sympathy with something external." Alvarez laid the data across the observatory table, comparing it to their models of 3i divided by Atlas's rotational cycle. The alignment was exact. Each seismic pulse matched the object's rhythm, as though the planet itself was already tethered to the intruder by invisible strings. "It's already touching us," she whispered, horrified. "It hasn't even arrived, and it's touching us." In coastal towns, the tremors manifested as anomalies. Fishermen in Indonesia reported sudden unnatural tides, the sea surging without storm or moon. In California, beaches saw waves collapse strangely, pulled back by unseen forces. And in the heartland of Europe, far from oceans, ancient stone buildings creaked and shifted, as if stirred by movements deep beneath the crust. Governments scrambled for explanations. Minor tectonic adjustments, they said. Harmless fluctuations. But people felt the difference. These were not the jagged shocks of earthquakes, not the violent ruptures of fault lines. They were pulses, rhythmic and patient, like a giant hand tapping gently on the world to remind it of what was coming. The whispers of mythology returned, stronger now. In online spaces, fragments of ancient lore resurfaced stories of gods striking the earth, of waves born without storms, of mountains trembling without reason. Some drew connections to the younger Dryas, to the sudden, violent climate shift millennia ago. Others invoked older myths, floods and fires described in languages long dead. The past, once dismissed as legend, now seemed less like fantasy and more like record. As days turned to weeks, the cracks became literal. In Turkey, a fissure opened suddenly across farmland, swallowing fields whole. In South America, a mountain slope collapsed without warning, exposing layers of rock untouched for ages. Satellite images revealed jagged scars spreading across deserts and plains, lines the geologists struggled to explain. It was as if the planet's skin was beginning to tear in anticipation of something heavier pressing upon it. For Keller and Alvarez, the evidence was unbearable. They watched in silence as maps of seismic activity lit up like constellations, each point connected not to Earth's interior, but to the cosmic rhythm of the object drawing near. Humanity had thought of 3i divided by Atlas as distant, a speck among the stars. But now they saw the truth. The encounter had already begun, the planet itself answering to the intruder's presence. Late one night, Keller whispered the thought that had haunted him for weeks. Maybe Earth remembers it. Maybe it's not the first time. Alvarez did not reply. She didn't need to. The cracks in the Earth were not just geological, they were historical. Echoes of scars carved long before human memory. The world above remained outwardly calm. Markets reopened, schools carried on, and politicians smiled on screens. But beneath their feet, the planet shuddered, cracking quietly under the weight of something no denial could hold back. The countdown was no longer hidden in equations or simulations. It was written now in stone. Fractured trust. When the Earth itself began to tremble in rhythm, with 3i divided by Atlas, denial could no longer function as it once had. The government still spoke of minor anomalies, but their tone wavered, their words weighed down with hesitation. The public, sensing the cracks not only in the Earth but in authority, turned elsewhere for truth. And what they found, through leaks, whispers, and half-hidden broadcasts, shattered the fragile thread of trust binding nations to their people. It began with a leak larger than any before. A packet of files, released anonymously on the dark web, contained fragments of the classified Geneva meeting. Though heavily redacted, Key phrases bled through: impact probabilities above acceptable thresholds, gravitational resonance, multi-continental casualty projections. For those who had followed the whispers, the files were confirmation. For those who had trusted the official line, they were betrayal. News outlets, once cautious, now broke ranks. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the magnitude of the revelations, began broadcasting reports that contradicted official reassurances. Talk shows debated openly what had once been dismissed as conspiracy, and when independent scientists confirmed the alignment of seismic pulses with the object's rotation, the facade of denial cracked wide open. The world's citizens felt the shift instantly. Panic flared, but so too did anger. Protests erupted in major cities, crowds demanding transparency. In New York, demonstrators carried signs that read, "Tell us the truth." In Berlin, voices thundered, "You knew, and you hid it." Clashes with police turned violent, smoke rising over streets where order once stood. Trust between nations also began to fracture. Intelligence leaks revealed that certain governments had known of 3I divided by Atlas's trajectory months earlier than others, hoarding information to buy time for themselves. Suspicions deepened when satellite images showed massive underground construction projects in Siberia, China, and the American Midwest structures, eerily reminiscent of bunkers. To the public, it was proof. Leaders were preparing not to save everyone, but to save only themselves. Alvarez read the reports with a grim face. "They're abandoning them," she whispered to Keller, her voice tight with fury. "They're leaving billions to die, and hiding it behind smiles." Keller nodded, though his expression was hollow. "That's what power does," he said softly. "It saves itself first." Religions, too, fractured under the weight of the truth. Some faiths declared 3I divided by Atlas, a divine judgment, their leaders proclaiming that preparation was futile. Others preached resistance, urging believers to demand accountability from governments. Splinter groups formed, cults promising salvation through rituals, sacrifices, or violent rejection of the old world order. Fear became fuel for division, pulling communities apart. Even within the scientific community, fractures deepened. Those who had once guarded their careers with silence began to speak, denouncing institutions that had gagged them. "They told us not to alarm the public," confessed one seismologist in a televised interview. "But how do you silence the Earth itself?" Her words echoed across millions of screens, a battle cry for truth. The fracture spread into homes, into families. Arguments erupted at dinner tables, parents insisting on trust in authority, children demanding acknowledgement of the obvious sky. Brothers turned on sisters, friends on friends, divided not only by fear of the object but by fear of one another. Trust, once invisible and assumed, became the rarest currency in a collapsing world. Keller and Alvarez, watching the unraveling, felt their own bond strain under the weight. They had been united by discovery, by secrecy, by whispered fears. Now, in the chaos of fractured trust, they found themselves asking different questions. Should they speak openly, even if it invited ruin? Or should they remain hidden, preserving what little safety silence still allowed? The world was tearing apart long before the object arrived. 3I divided by Atlas had not yet unleashed its waves, but it had already succeeded in its first act of destruction. It had broken humanity's faith in itself. The last conference, as trust disintegrated and nations turned inward, a desperate attempt was made to reclaim unity. Invitations were sent under strict secrecy, summoning the world's leading scientists, engineers, and policymakers to a final gathering. One last attempt to forge a plan before chaos made plans impossible. The location was chosen carefully. A secluded island facility in the Atlantic, far from the eyes of protesters, journalists, and civilians. It was called a conference, but those who attended knew it was more like a tribunal for the fate of humanity. Keller and Alvarez were not invited. Their names had been scrubbed from official registers long ago, their warnings deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. But through a sympathetic colleague, they received fragments of the agenda. The topics were clear enough: mitigation strategies, survival protocols, resource allocation. It was less a conversation about prevention, more a grim negotiation over who would be allowed to live through what was coming. The conference opened with cold numbers. Orbital models projected onto vast screens showed the object's trajectory narrowing into a corridor of dread. Probabilities fluctuated between near miss and direct impact, but the conclusion was the same. Earth would not emerge untouched. A physicist from Moscow delivered it plainly. Impact or resonance. The planet will suffer global-scale disruption. Oceans will not remain in their basins. The crust will not remain stable. No region will be immune. Arguments erupted immediately. Representatives from coastal nations demanded global evacuations, warning that to delay would guarantee millions of deaths. Landlocked nations, already preparing in silence, resisted, unwilling to absorb panicked refugees. A general from Beijing dismissed the notion entirely, declaring that resources must be preserved for those who could ensure humanity's continuity, not wasted on what he called a doomed coastline. The debate spiraled into bitter accusations. Americans accused Russians of hoarding underground shelters. Europeans accused China of stockpiling food reserves. Smaller nations accused everyone of abandoning them. At one point, an aide whispered into the ear of his president, and the leader stormed out, shouting, "This is not a conference, it is a carving of graves." In quieter corners of the meeting, scientists attempted to present radical solutions. One team proposed launching a barrage of nuclear warheads to attempt deflection, despite the known futility. Another suggested using gravitational tractors, massive ships whose pull could over decades shift the object's path. The idea was met with grim silence. Decades were a luxury humanity no longer had. The most controversial presentation came from a coalition of private aerospace firms. They unveiled designs for orbital arcs, giant vessels meant to preserve a fraction of humanity off-world. The concept was more dream than plan, requiring technologies barely tested. Yet the mere mention of escape fractured the conference further, sparking outrage among nations that knew they would never be given passage. By the third day, the conference was collapsing. Delegates shouted over one another, alliances forming and dissolving in hours. Some left entirely, their motorcades retreating in silence, unwilling to waste more words on impossible solutions. Others stayed, desperate, clinging to the fantasy that consensus might still emerge, but consensus never came. When the conference finally adjourned, no global plan had been agreed upon. Each nation left with its own secret strategies, its own quiet preparations. Some would dig deeper into the earth, building bunkers for the chosen few. Others would invest in fleets, hoping to scatter across the seas. Many would do nothing at all, resigned to fate. Outside the facility, the Atlantic winds howled across empty beaches, indifferent to human quarrels. And above, in the black silence of space, 3I divided by Atlas continued its patient approach, oblivious to the shouting, the denial, the desperation. For Keller and Alvarez, who learned of the conference's collapse through whispered accounts, the message was clear. Humanity had squandered its last chance to act together. What lay ahead was not a united defense, but a fractured descent into survival at any cost. The object had not yet touched Earth, but already it had dismantled the fragile illusion of global unity. The last conference would be remembered not as the moment humanity came together, but as the moment it surrendered to division. Night of the Unknowns. The collapse of the last conference marked a turning point. With no shared plan, no unified message, humanity entered a twilight of uncertainty. It was not yet the end, but it felt like the eve of something vast and unstoppable. And then came the night, when the world itself could no longer be shielded from what was coming. For months, 3I divided by Atlas had been a rumor, a whisper among scientists, a contested speck in telescopes. But now it emerged naked to the human eye. It began subtly, as a faint star that did not belong in familiar constellations. Farmers noticed it first, pointing out to their children a new star that pulsed faintly. Fishermen on calm seas saw its glimmer just above the horizon, steady, unwavering. Soon, anyone who looked up on a clear night could see it, no telescope required. The effect was electric. News anchors who had mocked conspiracy theories now found themselves broadcasting images captured by ordinary cameras. Politicians fumbled for explanations, retreating into vague platitudes. Astronomical phenomena, rare but harmless. But the words rang false, and people knew it. There was no denying something immense was out there, shining like an omen in the night. Crowds gathered in open fields, on rooftops, on beaches. Some brought telescopes and binoculars, others only their naked eyes. In every language, the same questions spilled from lips. What is it? How close will it come? And always, beneath those questions, the deeper one no leader could answer. Will we survive? Religious fervor ignited. In South America, preachers claimed the object was the returning star of prophecy, heralding judgment. In the Middle East, muezzins wove mentions of it into prayer, reminding followers of the fragility of life. Across Europe, church bells rang, some in warning, others in mourning. Cults sprang up overnight, promising safety in rituals, sacrifices, or seclusion. To many, the night sky no longer inspired wonder, it demanded fear. Yet not all who gazed upon it were afraid. For some, there was awe. Artists painted it, poets wrote of its silent majesty, lovers lay beneath its glow, whispering that they might as well embrace while time still allowed. Children laughed, calling it the traveler star. In those brief moments, humanity remembered that even in dread, beauty could still emerge. But the awe was fragile, shattered by new leaks. Amateur astronomers, now emboldened, streamed live feeds showing the object's peculiar shimmer. The luminous trails that had once been dismissed as camera errors now blazed clearly in the open sky. The patterns were undeniable, symmetrical, deliberate, almost geometric. The forums exploded with one chilling consensus: this was no simple comet or asteroid. Its light carried intent. Governments struggled to maintain control. Emergency broadcasts tried to soothe, but their words sounded increasingly hollow against the visible truth above. Panic took root in certain cities. In Los Angeles, thousands flooded freeways, convinced the coast would soon be swallowed by waves. In Manila, people stormed supermarkets, fighting over bottled water. Meanwhile, in quieter towns, families gathered in their homes, silent, staring through windows at the foreign star. Keller and Alvarez stood outside their observatory that night, their faces pale under the starlight. Around them, colleagues whispered, some praying, some arguing, but all transfixed by the new presence in the sky. "This is the night it stops being ours," Keller said softly. "The truth is no longer for the few, it's for everyone." Alvarez didn't reply. She only stared upward, as if trying to memorize every detail of the shimmering object before it grew closer still. The night of the unknowns lasted only a few hours, but it changed everything. Humanity could no longer pretend. The intruder had revealed itself, glowing with silent certainty above billions of eyes. Awe and dread mixed together like two currents colliding, pulling civilization into waters it had never sailed before. From that night forward, time itself seemed different. The stars were no longer eternal. They were counting down. The first wave. The object had revealed itself to human eyes, a luminous intruder painted across the heavens. But the night of the unknowns had barely settled before the Earth gave its first violent response. It was not an impact, not a fireball streaking through the atmosphere. It was the ocean. It began in the Pacific, where tidal monitors along remote atolls registered anomalies. At first, the readings looked like technical glitches, numbers too large to be possible, currents moving against prevailing winds. But then came the eyewitness reports, fishermen describing the sea retreating unnaturally far, exposing reefs that had never been bare, followed minutes later by waves towering higher than lighthouses. Entire villages were swept away before emergency networks even understood what had happened. From there, the phenomenon spread outward like a wound. Along the coasts of Chile, waves struck with no storm to precede them, slamming into harbors and dragging ships inland like toys. In New Zealand, a midnight surge shattered docks and flung boats onto highways. Across Hawaii, locals awoke to sirens too late, water thundering through neighborhoods in a roar that drowned every other sound. It was not a single catastrophic wall, but a pattern of surges, irregular yet eerily synchronized. Scientists, scrambling to explain, pointed to gravitational disruptions, small shifts in the Earth's oceans triggered by the object's growing influence. But privately, many admitted something far stranger. The waves matched the rhythm of 3I divided by Atlas's rotation, as though the ocean itself was being pulled into resonance with the intruder. Governments rushed to calm their populations. Press conferences framed the events as isolated tsunamis, blaming undersea quakes or volcanic disturbances, but the lies unraveled almost instantly. Seismographs showed no correlating quakes. The surges struck coasts far too distant, far too simultaneous, to be explained by local phenomena. The public, already suspicious, erupted in outrage. "You told us it was safe. You told us not to fear." Now the fear was undeniable. Keller and Alvarez watched the reports unfold from their observatory, their silence heavy with resignation. For months, they had predicted this waves without warning, tides unmoored by forces greater than the moon. But seeing it made the theory unbearable. On the screen before them, footage showed a coastal highway in California, swallowed in minutes. In Japan, live cameras captured seawater battering seawalls before collapsing into blackness. The first wave was no singular event. It was a chain reaction, an echo of what was still to come. The social order began to crack more visibly. Panic rippled through coastal cities. Evacuations attempted in chaos rather than planning. Families fled inland, clogging roads, abandoning homes. Property markets collapsed overnight, investors abandoning coastal real estate as worthless. Insurance companies folded under the weight of simultaneous claims. And in the midst of chaos, rumors spread like wildfire. This was only the beginning. Religions proclaimed the surges as proof of divine judgment. Preachers thundered that the end had begun. Survivalists declared vindication, fortifying bunkers and hoarding supplies. Meanwhile, scientists, those still allowed to speak, warned in quiet tones that the energy released in these preliminary waves was negligible compared to what an actual close pass would unleash. The first wave was merely the planet's shiver, not yet its scream. Alvarez turned to Keller as another report arrived of villages in the Philippines disappearing beneath black water. "This is just resonance," she said softly, horror trembling in her voice. "Imagine when it comes closer." Keller closed his eyes, unable to respond. He didn't need to. Both of them knew the truth. The world had been given a preview, a glimpse of the violence waiting beyond the horizon. For those who lived inland, far from coasts, the first wave was only a headline, a distant tragedy. But for millions who stood in its path, it was the moment denial ended forever. The seas had spoken, rising without storm, without quake, without warning. And what they whispered was clear. The true disaster had not yet arrived. The shattered skies. The oceans had risen first, their surges announcing that Earth was no longer its own. But soon, the sky itself began to fracture. What began as subtle disturbances in weather patterns escalated into chaos that no meteorologist could explain. Air traffic controllers were among the first to feel it. Pilots reported sudden turbulence in clear skies, jets buffeted as though striking invisible walls. Instruments failed mid-flight, compasses spinning aimlessly before snapping back. One airline was forced to ground half its fleet after 3 near collisions in a single week. Officials blamed atmospheric instability, but those words rang hollow. Then came the satellites. Thousands of metallic eyes orbiting Earth began to blink out one by one. Some tumbled from orbit, their wreckage streaking as fire across the night. Others spun wildly, their transmissions reduced to static. Astronomers whispered of unseen forces distorting the upper atmosphere, dragging satellites into premature decay. To those who studied the orbits, the explanation was chilling. The skies themselves were being tugged by the growing gravity of 3I divided by Atlas. For ordinary people, the signs became impossible to ignore. Storms erupted with no warning, spawning tornadoes in regions where they had never existed. Lightning carved across entire horizons, searing night into day. Auroras spilled far beyond their polar boundaries, glowing blood-red above cities unaccustomed to such lights. In the deserts of Africa, rain fell in sheets, while Europe baked under drought. The climate was no longer chaotic by chance, it was being rewritten. Keller sat at his console, watching live feeds from weather satellites flicker and die. "It's tearing the atmosphere apart," he whispered. Alvarez, pale, nodded. "The ionosphere's reacting. It's resonating like a drumhead." Neither dared to say the fuller truth. The planet's protective layers were weakening. As skies cracked, communication faltered. With satellites gone, GPS failed. Ships drifted off course. Planes rerouted clumsily. Supply chains unraveled. Global markets froze, no longer able to track shipments or currencies in real time. Panic rippled not just through streets but through the fragile web of systems humanity had woven into the sky. Footage spread across news channels of entire cities plunged into blackout as grids failed under atmospheric surges. In New Delhi, transformers exploded in cascading arcs of fire, leaving millions in darkness. In Brazil, lightning storms raged for 24 straight hours, shattering windows and igniting forests. Across North America, people gathered outside, staring upward at skies swirling with auroras that painted the horizon in unearthly hues. The beauty was undeniable, but beauty laced with terror. Religions and cults found fuel in the shattered skies. Some proclaimed the heavens themselves had broken, proof of apocalypse. Others saw salvation, the skies opening like a gateway to a promised world. But for most, awe curdled into dread. The atmosphere that had always sheltered them was now a battlefield between Earth and the intruder. Governments scrambled for answers, but their words lost power. Each denial sounded absurd when people could look upward and see with their own eyes skies behaving like never before. The credibility of authority dissolved completely, replaced by a primal fear, the sense that the world itself had turned alien. In one haunting video, a man in Alaska filmed the night sky alive with green and red auroras, streaked by falling satellites burning like comets. His voice trembled as he spoke into the camera. "It's not space anymore, it's breaking. The sky is breaking." Hours later, the feed cut off, his town struck by a power grid collapse. For Keller and Alvarez, the shattered skies marked the final confirmation. The oceans had risen, the earth had cracked, and now the heavens themselves faltered. 3I divided by Atlas had not yet arrived, yet its approach was unmaking the planet piece by piece. They knew the worst was still to come, but already it felt as if the world had slipped past the point of return. The sky was no longer a shield, it was a warning, and the warning burned above every human head, written in lightning and fire. Collapse of order. The oceans had surged, the skies had fractured, and now the weight of panic pressed fully upon human civilization. What had once been murmurs in the shadows erupted into full-scale collapse. The world had always balanced precariously on the fragile threads of law, commerce, and trust. With those threads fraying, order unraveled almost overnight. It began in the cities. After the first waves and the shattered skies, supply lines faltered. Supermarkets emptied within days, people stripping shelves bare of food and water. Gasoline became more precious than currency. Long lines at stations gave way to chaos, fistfights, riots, and finally armed clashes as desperate crowds fought over dwindling reserves. Governments attempted to impose rationing, but enforcement quickly failed. Police forces, overwhelmed and underpaid, either deserted or turned their weapons inward, becoming just another faction in the scramble to survive. In capitals across the world, leaders went on television to reassure their populations. Their faces were pale, their voices tight, their promises hollow. Citizens no longer listened. Every speech of calm was answered, with footage of waves swallowing coasts, of cities burning in electrical storms, of satellites falling like fire onto empty fields. The illusion of control dissolved, and with it, the willingness of people to obey. In rural regions, militias formed, some under banners of protection, others under banners of conquest. Highways became hunting grounds where travelers risked ambush. Cities walled themselves in, barricading roads, turning once open neighborhoods into fortresses. In coastal towns, where the first surges had struck, survivors abandoned their homes in droves, flooding inland by the millions. They carried stories of drowned villages and empty harbors, fueling fear far beyond the reach of the water. Keller and Alvarez received messages from colleagues abroad, scientists now turned refugees. One wrote from Italy, describing how mobs stormed observatories, blaming astronomers for summoning the object. Another from California said, research centers were burned, their servers smashed, as if destroying data could undo destiny. "They want someone to blame," Alvarez whispered, holding the messages with trembling hands. Keller nodded grimly. "And we are the easiest targets." Governments turned on each other as well. Borders hardened, armies redeployed not outward but inward, guarding food stores and bunker entrances. Rumors spread of hidden shelters stocked for the elite, guarded by soldiers who fired on civilians attempting to break in. Leaked satellite images showed convoys moving underground in Siberia and Nevada, reinforcing suspicions that survival had been reserved for the powerful. To the abandoned billions, it was betrayal made visible. Religions splintered. Some groups embraced fatalism, declaring that resistance was sin and surrender divine. Others demanded violent purification, attacking those they deemed unworthy. In South America, entire villages marched into mountains, claiming salvation awaited there. In the Middle East, rival sects clashed violently over whose prophecy claimed the intruder. Faith, once a pillar of stability, now fractured into weapons. Technology itself faltered. With satellites gone and grids failing, communication became patchwork. Some regions relied on ham radios, others on handwritten messages. The internet flickered in and out, no longer a global web, but a mosaic of fragments. In that silence, rumors festered unchecked, spreading fear faster than truth. Keller and Alvarez withdrew into the observatory, locking doors, rationing supplies, speaking only in whispers. Outside, the world no longer resembled the one they had known. "It's not the waves or the skies that will kill us first," Keller murmured one night. "It's ourselves. We're tearing apart before it even arrives." Alvarez, staring at the dim glow of 3i divided by Atlas in the sky, replied, "Maybe that's the real test. Maybe it isn't just survival of the planet, but survival of what we are." The collapse was not sudden but steady, like a slow-motion avalanche. Each day brought a new fracture, governments falling, communities breaking, families splintering under the weight of fear. Civilization had built itself on the promise of tomorrow. Now that promise had been stolen, and without it, humanity devoured itself. The object had not yet touched Earth, but order had already died. The collapse was complete, not by cosmic force, but by the weakness of human hands, unable to hold each other when the sky began to fall. The long silence. When order crumbled, noise ruled: sirens, riots, shouts, the endless thrum of chaos. But chaos cannot sustain itself forever. Eventually, exhaustion set in. Cities burned until they had nothing left to give. Protests roared until throats went hoarse, and governments shouted promises until no one listened. Then came the silence. It was not peace. It was the absence of what once filled the world. Streets once alive with traffic now stood empty, hushed but for the distant crack of collapsing buildings. Radios sputtered static. Television channels blinked into blackness one by one, until screens carried only reflections of frightened faces. The internet, fractured and gasping, flickered with fewer voices each day, until forums that had once burned with fear became tombs of unanswered posts. Keller and Alvarez lived within this silence, their observatory transformed from a place of discovery into a refuge. Nights were darker now, the artificial glow of cities dimmed by outages and abandonment. Above them, the object loomed brighter than ever, no longer a speck but a presence, an unwelcome star that watched without blinking. The silence carried weight. It pressed against the mind, filling spaces once occupied by the chatter of neighbors, the hum of machines, the simple comfort of background life. Survivors in scattered towns described the same sensation, that the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Stories trickled in through fragile networks. A fishing village in Norway, once crowded with boats, now stood empty, its residents vanished inland. A desert town in Nevada reported only a handful of families left, gathered nightly around fires, listening to the distant echo of jets guarding bunkers they would never see. In India, entire neighborhoods fell into wordless ritual, sitting outside each evening in silence, staring upward at the growing glow of the sky. The few surviving radio operators began broadcasting not news but fragments of poetry, scripture, or simple greetings. "We are still here. If you hear this, you are not alone." Across continents, scattered listeners clung to these voices, their static-laced syllables like threads stitching together a world unraveling. But even these signals grew rarer, each station going dark one by one. Amid the silence, a question grew louder in the minds of those who endured. What exactly was 3i divided by Atlas? Was it stone? Was it ice? Was it something far stranger? The vanished probe haunted them. Rumors persisted that it had transmitted not failure, but understanding that the object was more than matter, more than a simple interstellar shard. Some whispered it was alive in some fashion, or the ruin of something that once was. Others clung to the belief that it was a weapon, aimed long ago, now arriving at the time of its choosing. For Keller and Alvarez, silence was filled with their own unanswered questions. They worked by candlelight when the generators failed, poring over notebooks and calculations. Again and again, the data pointed to the same inevitability. Whether collision or resonance, Earth would suffer. But beneath the math lay the deeper dread. Neither wanted to voice that they were not observing a natural visitor, but something with history, something that had been here before. The long silence was not only external but internal. Conversations shrank to whispers, laughter vanished. Even arguments lost their strength. Humanity, in its scattered pockets of survival, had nothing left to say except the occasional prayer, the occasional plea. And so the silence stretched, as the intruder grew larger in the night sky. To look upward was to feel both awe and terror. Awe at the vastness of the cosmos. Terror at the certainty that the cosmos had noticed Earth. The stars, once countless and eternal, now felt like a backdrop for a single actor approaching center stage. When the silence deepened to the point where even radios went dark, the world seemed suspended between two heartbeats. Civilization had collapsed, yet the final blow had not yet fallen. It was as if Earth itself lingered in a pause, the long inhale before the scream. For Keller and Alvarez, it was unbearable. One night, staring upward, Alvarez whispered, the only words either of them had spoken in hours. "It's not the end that terrifies me. It's the waiting." And above, indifferent, 3I divided by Atlas kept coming. After the waves, when the waves finally came, they did not roar with cinematic suddenness. They rose with slow inevitability, swelling higher and higher until the coasts of the world were swallowed. Mountains of water crashed across continents, erasing cities in moments, leaving only broken skylines jutting above the foam like gravestones. The seas reached far inland, drowning valleys, claiming farmland, remapping the face of the earth. Yet even then, not every life was extinguished. Some clung to higher ground, others found refuge in mountains, plateaus, or bunkers built in secrecy. The survivors carried with them the weight of everything: lost families torn away, cultures erased, histories swept beneath water. When at last the waters receded, they left behind a planet scarred beyond recognition, its coastlines redrawn, its population reduced to a fraction. The skies, too, bore wounds. Satellites were gone, communications broken, the heavens littered with the remains of shattered machines. But slowly, as the atmosphere calmed, the stars revealed themselves again. Yet one star was missing. 3I divided by Atlas, having passed, was gone. It did not linger, did not strike again. It drifted back into the cosmic dark, indifferent to the ruin it had wrought. In the silence that followed, survivors gathered. They huddled in caves and on mountainsides, sharing food, telling stories by firelight. Slowly, fragments of communication re-emerged, crackling radios, faint signals bouncing between the remnants of civilizations. People spoke not of governments or nations, but of survival, of rebuilding. The old structures of power had collapsed, their bunkers filled with those who had tried to save themselves alone. In many cases, those places never reopened, sealed tombs rather than shelters. Keller and Alvarez, among the few who survived in their remote observatory, watched the aftermath with weary eyes. Their instruments were ruined, their data soaked in salt and silence, but their memories remained. They spoke little of the waves themselves. Instead, they wondered about the object that had brought them. Was it merely a wanderer, or had it been something older, with intent carved into its path? They would never know. The probe had vanished, the answers gone with it. Yet questions lingered. Why had it come so close? Why had it carried such resonance with Earth, stirring oceans and skies before its passing? Some survivors whispered that it had been sent, a weapon or a warning from forces beyond human grasp. Others clung to older myths, saying it was the return of a destroyer known to their ancestors, now departed once again to wait in silence until the cycle renewed. The planet itself seemed to breathe differently. Forests drowned and regrew. Rivers carved new paths across scarred lands. The sea, now vaster than before, claimed whole nations, creating archipelagos from once mighty empires. Humanity, reduced but not extinguished, adapted to this reshaped Earth, and in the quiet nights that followed, people found themselves staring upward again, not with denial, not with panic, but with a wary reverence. They had seen the fragility of their world exposed, felt the indifference of the cosmos made manifest. The stars were no longer distant ornaments, they were reminders. Keller and Alvarez, sitting together beneath the ruined dome of the observatory, watched the heavens with the same awe that had once drawn them into science. "It's gone," Keller murmured one night, his voice trembling with exhaustion. Alvarez shook her head softly. "Not gone, just waiting." For though the skies seemed clear again, the memory of 3I divided by Atlas remained. It had come, it had scarred the Earth, and it had left. but its presence had changed everything. Humanity would rebuild, yes, but it would rebuild with the knowledge that the universe was not a silent backdrop. It was alive with threats, with mysteries, with visitors that might come again. And so, after the waves, the world endured, smaller, humbler, fractured, yet alive. The survivors carried forward, not just their grief, but their questions. They would tell stories of the object, stories that would echo through generations, warnings for children yet unborn. In those stories, 3I divided by Atlas would never be just a comet, never just a rock. It would be remembered as the destroyer, the visitor, the ancient shadow in the stars, and perhaps, in some distant age when it returned once more, humanity or whatever remained of it would remember. The planet was quiet now, too quiet. The silence after the waves was heavy, uneasy, but it was also full of possibility. Life had endured catastrophe before, and it would again. But somewhere beyond the stars, the object drifted still, indifferent, eternal, carrying with it the unanswered question of why it had come at all. The survivors would never know. They only knew this: the Earth had changed, and so had they. The waves had come, the waves had passed, but the memory of them would never fade.